Welcome to Breadboarding. In the previous video we managed to get the PS2 mouse working with Windows 1, 2 and 3, and we had a quick look at these versions of Windows that we didn't spend very long looking at them. In this video I'm going to be comparing Windows 1, 2 and 3. Windows 1 will be 40 years old later on this year. So this is video 64 in the Breadboard 8088 PC series. So Windows 1 was released in November 1985. So this year it will be coming up to 40 years old. There were one or two earlier releases, alpha and development releases, but this was the official retail release. Windows 2 came out about 2 years later, 1987, and then Windows 3.0, May 1990, and this was probably the most significant Windows update, probably in the early years. Now there's an interesting site by David Simonich, and he set up a website dedicated to Windows 1.0, so we're just going to have a quick look at that. And some of the information I've got has been from here, in particular the version information, all the pre-release information here, and the retail versions, and in particular the 103 is what we've been using. I believe this was released in 1986, not in August 85, because that would have been before the first release, and it's referred to 1986 here as well, but other than that I think a lot of the information in here is very useful. In particular talks about software. One of the issues with Windows 1 was very little software available for it, and I think he's listed some of the software here. Another site here, which I'll include these URLs in the description below if you want to have a look at these yourself. And this actually includes screenshots of early versions of applications that run on Windows 1, 2 and 3. So you'll see that PageMaker was probably one of the main applications initially, and a couple of paintbrush programs. So in particular PC Paintbrush, I think a version of this ended up getting bundled with Windows 3, was rebadged and bundled as Windows 3. So there wasn't a lot of software available when Windows 1 came out. So you can see that the PC Paintbrush, PageMaker. Now in the early days the video card that we've got in the Breadboard PC is a CGA compatible card, so color graphics adapter. The EGA was the most sophisticated card available at the time of the release of Windows 1.0, and that did 640 by 350 pixels and would allow up to 16 colours, I believe, 16 out of that 64 colour palette. The Hercules video card was similar to the CGA in that it did 640 by 200 black and white. And it's only really that when the 1.04 release of Windows 1.0 came out in 1988, which supported the PS2, that actually did support VGA. But at this point in time, then VGA was already supported in Windows 2. Now one of the easiest ways to actually play around with these early versions of Windows is through the PCJS.org website, and this rather cleverly manages to run and emulate early versions of the original PC, PCXT, PC80 and some of the 386s, and this is done entirely in JavaScript, so you can run these within your web browser. So I've got a number of these running here, so all you need to do is to click on the URLs that I'll include in the description below. When you run it up, you then got full access to Windows, and you'll see that when we're in Windows 1.0 you actually have to hold the mouse button down to move around the menus. If you release the mouse button, the menu disappears, and that's different from later versions of Windows. If we click on the programs, then just show the programs, and this is very similar to what I've been showing you in some of the earlier videos where I've actually been using screen capture from the real Breadboard PC. But if you want to play around with this, then you can do so. The only thing you can't really do is the keyboard shortcut for the control menu here is actually Alt spacebar, and if you do Alt spacebar it'll actually do the control menu for the web browser. So in fact there are one or two things you can't do in the PCJS version, particularly to do with keyboard shortcuts. And then we've also got here, this is a Compact Desk Pro 386 with VGA, and this is actually running Windows 2, but it's the Windows 386 version of Windows 2. So there were a number of different versions of Windows. In particular, certain of the big manufacturers would quite often get a special version of Windows made for them before it was generally available. So Win386 was actually a version of Windows 2.0 which was specifically designed for the 386 because Compaq released a 386 machine before any of the other manufacturers. So you can see here that this is now actually running in VGA, and you'll also see that when we click the menu here, once you click on the menu it actually stays up, which is different from what we saw in Windows 1.0. And you can also see that some of the icons up here have also changed. And we'll be looking at the comparison of these in a few minutes. And then finally, you have to press Escape to get the mouse to come out of the window here. And the Windows 3 here, we'll run this up. So this is IBM PC 80 running EGA. Now one of the confusing things here is you can see where the mouse highlighter is here, that the mouse in the virtual machine here is slightly different from where the mouse with the highlighter is. But you can play around with these versions, it works surprisingly well, and there's also quite a lot of games, and even you can run up Windows 95 and other versions. So if you want to have a play with Windows 1, 2 and 3, you can use the links below in the description to access the PCJS.org. It's a very impressive site. So we're going to be focusing on the Intel 8088 and 8086. So this is real mode. So real mode is the original sort of 640 1 megabyte limit, and this is the mode in which the BIOS runs. And in fact, even modern computers today, if you bought a computer today, they still boot up in real mode initially before switching into some of the extended modes like the enhanced mode, 32-bit or even 64-bit modes. So we're not going to be worrying too much about the 286 protected mode, which in Windows 3 became known as standard mode, and also the 386 enhanced mode in Windows 3.0, which this has actually gone forward into later versions, so Windows 95 etc. have all made use of the 386 32-bit architecture. Going to have a quick look at comparing the installation for Windows 1, 2 and 3. Switching between the installers running on the Breadboard PC is a little bit clunky, and it's not quite so easy to do in the PCJS environment just because the way how I have to switch the floppy disk drives around. So what I've done is I've taken some screenshots from running on the Breadboard PC running in installers. So what we're going to be doing is comparing some screenshots from Windows 1 and 2 and in particular, and then also looking at Windows 3 as well. So to start with, the key thing really is that Windows 1 and Windows 2 only support installation from the A floppy drive. And one of the tricks we used in the earlier videos was use the DOS substitute command, and with that what we can do is make the A drive appear to be an installation folder. So we actually had the installation files in the Win103 install and then accessed it through the A drive. Now Windows 1.0, 2.0 support installation to floppy disk and hard drive. So you could actually run early versions of Windows off a floppy disk if you only had, say, twin floppy drives in your PC. But really, realistically, running off the hard disk is the only real sensible version these days. And Windows 3.0 supports installation to hard disk only. Now in Windows 1.0 there was no PS2 mouse option, there was only the serial and bus mouse options, although the PS2 mouse was added later in the 1.04 release, and that was actually in fact after Windows 2 was initially released. And in fact, to get the PS2 mouse working in the previous video, what we did is copy the Windows 2 mouse driver into Windows 1.0 when we did the installation. So this is comparing what the mouse options are. So Windows 1, we had no pointing device. I'll talk about this in a minute. Mice were actually quite expensive and quite rare in these days. Certainly until about 1986, then buying a mouse was actually quite an expensive thing, and I'll got some adverts to show you how much they cost in a minute or two. But you can see here we don't have the PS2 mouse here, we only have the Microsoft mouse bus serial. But in fact, if we'd done that trick of copying the Windows 2 driver into the Windows 1 installation folder, then in fact choosing this option would in fact enable the PS2 mouse. Then in the Windows 2 installation, you can see that it's slightly different. It's sort of been updated a little, and you can see now that in addition to the Microsoft mouse bus or serial, there's also a Microsoft mouse connected to PS2 mouse pointer. Now I think these would actually result in installing the same driver, but at least the option was there. And then you'll notice that in Windows 3 this installation style became much more used in later Windows versions. So Windows 3 really introduced this sort of blue installation screen, and this was then used in a lot of later Windows versions up until relatively recently, I think. You can see here we've got the Microsoft or IBM PS2 mouse, this particular one. Then it comes to the video controllers or the display adapters, as I think some of these screens will show. And Windows 1.0 just included support for CGA, Hercules and EGA. We have a look at the Windows 1.0 graphics adapters. You can see that option 1 was the IBM CGA, or similar to the compact personal computer adapter. Hercules was basically a monochrome display adapter but with some graphics support, so it's basically like a black and white CGA card, I guess would be the closest. And you can see here that the EGA cards were available here, and EGA really came in the PC-AT. When the PC-AT was released, then EGA came out. Then in Windows 2 again you can see that we've got the CGA, EGA, and also can also see this fairly rare one, the MCGA, was actually a multicolour graphics array, and this actually was in the low-end PS2 range. I think the PS2 25 and 30 included the MCGA. Now I was originally going to try and upgrade the CGA video adapter that we've built to support this. Unfortunately, one of the things you'll see in Windows 3 is that the video driver this only supported 286s and above. You can also see here that we've got the VGA graphics adapter here, and again a variety of other vendors. And one of the things that was also introduced in Windows 2 is other. So if a hardware vendor provided a driver disk, then you'd select that option, put it in the A drive, and then it would install it from there. And then in Windows 3 you'll see that there's quite a few extra options in here. The 8514, this was actually from the higher end PS2 lines, and this was XGA. So this was a 1024 by 768 resolution, a massive resolution back in those days, particularly when you were dealing with 640 by 200 pixels with CGA. And there's a second screen here, and you can see as well we've got the VGA here, and in fact IBM MCGA supports 286 only. So I suspect there were some instructions which were only available in the 286 upwards were used in the video driver, which would mean we wouldn't have been able to use that in the Breadboard PC. And then what also happened in Windows 2 and Windows 3 also required the selection of a computer type. And in actual fact, the 1.04 release of Windows 1 also had the computer type, in that it introduced support for the PS2 range. So in Windows 2, we need to choose whether or not we've got a PS2 25 or 30 or one of the higher models. So the PS2 25 or 30 were really quite limited machines. They were really designed as a replacement for the PC and the PC XT, whereas these other machines were actually 286s, 386s, and in later times 486s. But we chose the PC XT AT for the Breadboard PC. And then the Windows 3 setup was a bit more complex in that it shows you what the default options are, and then you go in and actually change the options. So we'll change this to be an MS-DOS or PC-DOS system, and you can see here that the 386 and 486 sort of systems have started to appear here. And then this is the screen after the various video and mouse selection screens and country and keyboard settings. So these are the settings that he actually ran on the Breadboard PC. So it's an MS-DOS PC-DOS system, CGA, with a PS2 mouse, a UK keyboard, no networking. So you'll see that the early installers were very basic. The fact that they were only runnable from the A drive was quite limiting, but Windows 3.0 onwards really became a lot more familiar, and anyone who's done any installations with Windows 95, Windows NT, then this look and feel of the installer was used for many years afterwards. So now we're going to take a look at the comparison of the Windows 1, 2 and 3 various screen furniture, in that there were quite a few changes from one release to another, and then some changes were then actually, if not reversed, they were then modified, because obviously got rid of one thing and made it more difficult to do another. So let's take a look at those first of all. So the first one really is the control menu. So the control menu is the top left hand corner box that when you click on it, or if you use the Alt and the space bar at the same time, then you get this. And as you saw when we were using the PCJS screens, then the Alt space bar still actually works on the Windows 11. So this is one of the few shortcuts that still does persist. Now when you're actually using Windows 1, the mouse must be held down during menu use. So as soon as you release the mouse button, then the menu just disappears and it doesn't actually select an option. Now in Windows 2, then a number of keyboard shortcuts were introduced, and I'll talk about the mouse in a minute, because in the early stages mice weren't all that common and were relatively expensive. Then doing everything using the keyboard, you could use the keyboard for early versions of Windows, as I've shown in some of the early videos before we got the PS2 mouse working. Probably the only shortcut that's actually remained is Alt F4 to close Windows. So Alt F4 came in Windows 2 in around 1987. And also when we click on a menu in Windows 2 and upwards, then the menu remains. We then click on the selected item we want. We don't need to keep the mouse button held down to actually use the menus. And you'll also notice that the icon and zoom, so icon would minimize and zoom is maximize. So these were replaced with minimize and maximize, which have remained ever since. Now one of the things I noticed when using Windows 1, 2 and 3 together, that tiling multiple windows in Windows 1 was relatively straightforward. We just need to drag the icon for the application and drop it at an appropriate point on the screen. It would then tile the windows. You'll notice that the window borders in Windows 2 have actually now got fairly thick sort of handles for changing the height and width and for dragging the window sizes around. And we'll have a look at that on the next page. In doing this, it actually made it quite difficult to tile windows. And in fact, as we'll see in a couple of pages time, Windows 3 introduced a switch to, and this actually provided a pop-up window where we could actually tile multiple windows on the screen at the same time. So this is an example where something you could do quite easily in Windows 1 became difficult in Windows 2, and then they added a new feature in Windows 3 to actually allow you to tile windows more easily. So this is from a couple of editions of Byte magazine. So this is one of the main US magazines where a lot of the early announcements and things about new hardware and software were made. And the Microsoft mouse was introduced around 1983-84, and this just has a couple of adverts. So you can see from January 1984 about $169 for a mouse. A year or so later, so this was before Windows 1 was actually released, and a mouse was still going to set you back about $150. I do remember working on a project in around 1987-88 and having to use the keyboard in Windows 2 until such time as the expensive mouse arrived, which I think in that time was about £200 over in the UK. So these Windows shortcut keys were actually very short-lived. So the Alt F5 down to Alt F10, the next version of Windows, Windows 3, got rid of them, but Alt F4 is about the only one that remains until today. So the other key thing between Windows 1 and later versions of Windows, in Windows 1 you could only tile windows, they couldn't overlap. The only windows that would overlap would be a dialog box. Then in Windows 2 you're able to overlap windows. You can see that the borders were really quite thick, and that also the resize icon here has been replaced by the minimize and maximize buttons, and that resizing now is just done by dragging the borders. And then in Windows 3 you'll see that the Alt Escape key, or the option that you saw on the control menu, will actually allow you to switch to a particular application, cascade the windows, or tile the windows. So this would allow you to actually get the two applications to be automatically adjusted side by side. Windows 2 you actually had to drag the windows around and resize them to actually do this, which is quite awkward. So the window resize I showed in the previous video, but all you did on Windows 1 is dragged with the mouse the resize button here and drag the window to the size you wanted. If you were using the keyboard you could use the control menu and the move or resize, and then you could use the cursor keys to actually change the size of the window and position and press the enter key. And over here you'll see that this is a screenshot of this window being dragged. can see there's a few artifacts from where the video card hasn't quite worked properly, but this shows you that dragging this thick border here will actually allow you to resize the window here. And then you can also see that we've now got the minimize and maximize buttons there have replaced this sort of resize icon in the corner there. And then in Windows 3, similar, the resize has become a little bit thinner. Not quite as thin as it was in Windows 1, but it's a bit thinner than it was. You can see in Windows 2 it was quite thick. Windows 3 it's a bit thinner. And you can also see now that the minimize and maximize buttons have also then changed again. So there were quite a few changes between Windows releases. Really, until Windows 95 came out, then these then again changed, but have remained fairly constant since around Windows 95. So probably the biggest change going from Windows 1 and Windows 2 to Windows 3 was the replacement of the MS-DOS Executive, which is really effectively a file manager where you would click on the executable that you wanted to run. In Windows 2 it was pretty much the same, the only difference really being the resizing was done by dragging the borders and the icons obviously here. But then Program Manager made Windows very much easier to use for non-technical users. You weren't having to navigate around the file system and find an exe, you could just click on an icon. And the file manager also started to introduce folders and the hierarchical view, which was certainly easier to use than the way how the folders were navigated up in the MS-DOS Executive. So the introduction of Program Manager for Windows 3 was really probably what made it the most successful, in that the user interface previously was very much DOS orientated and this was more graphical. So we're up to about 21 minutes now, so I'm going to break the video there. So hopefully that's been of interest. Certainly it's taken me back to early days programming in Windows 2 and using a serial terminal to debug Windows applications, which is quite an experience. So what I'm going to be doing in the next video is probably going to be the last video in the Breadboard PC series, and I'm just going to be reviewing the state of the overall board layout and looking at some of the things that went well and some of the things that could be improved on. There have been a few issues and things I've had along the way. So if you don't want to miss out on future videos, please hit subscribe, and if you found the content interesting, please hit like as well. It just helps to make the videos available to more people. Thanks for watching.